How are you doing today? Uh, I know that the month of March is almost over. And it's way past International Women's Day, which took place on March the 8th. Um, but I should not let this month go by without actually um, elaborating on this particular holiday in regard to what it means as humanity steps forward. International Women's Day. Well, let's just say what it is. It's March the 8th. Every year is celebrated. Um, it is a day dedicated to the equality of women and women's empowerment. Contrary to what some traditionalists might say, International Women's Day and feminism is not just about equality of women, but equality of all people. The primary focus is gender equality. This includes the right to vote, or what we know as women's suffrage. Remember that? The right for women to run for office, the right to own property, reproductive rights, educational opportunity, and overall, I would say, social egalitarianism. Um, in order to appreciate International Women's Day, and I'm sorry, I had a long night. Anyway, um, I'm I'm a little sleepy right now. Sometimes I'm asleep, so I'm sorry. Okay, let me continue. In order to appreciate International Women's Day, in spite of the dreaded subject of politics, I know it's always political, isn't it? Um, the dreaded subject of politics. Yes, that subject. It's very important to recognize the socialist aspects of this holiday, which illustrates how socialism is the only meaningful way to expand equality for all people. You hear me rant, rave about that all the time on this channel. And history is very important. So let's start with the year 1900, with the Conference of Women's Issues set forth by the German Social Democratic Party. Um, yes, the SPD was one of the earliest socialist parties around the world to focus on women's equality. This is not to say that there were not other parties that were socialists around the world that were concerned about this, but the German SPD were one of the early parties to have a faction of the party that's actually promoting the idea of women's issues and women's equality. And there was the International Conference of Socialist Women that was set up in 1907 in Stuttgart, Germany. And Clara Zetkin of the SPD was in the conference and focused on women's participation of the workforce through labor activisms and the right to vote. Here in the USA, the Socialist Party of America set up a women's national committee in 1909 with similar goals. Here in America, we have a rich history of the women's movement and socialism through people like Emma Goldman, Helen Keller, Mother Jones, Margaret Sanger, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and living to this day, whose connections with the SPA, the Socialist Party of America, its successor organization, the Socialist Party USA, Mary Cowell Hollis, who was the 1996 Socialist Party USA candidate for president, and members of Democratic Socialists of America, including Barbara Einreich, Gloria Steinem, and we all know Alexandra Ocasio Cortez of New York. Sure, we're all familiar with her. And let's not forget Ilhan Omar, who was the first woman of color that became a elected socialist figure in American politics too. Although she was born in Somalia, um, part of the squad, which AOC is the most well known. So there is a rich history, and that stretches to this day, and we're all better for it. But let's go back to the year 1910. A second international conference socialist women's took place in Copenhagen, Denmark, with um, Clara Zetkin being one of the big organizers, and she pushed for reforms such as the 8-hour workday. Familiar with that? The 8-hour workday, and what would become later on known as maternity and paternity leave. Um, and you know that a lot of countries around the world, they're pretty good about that, and we're kind of piss poor about it here in the United States. Although, hopefully that could be eventually corrected down the road. Activism is very important in that regard. But these ideas historically were spreading through Europe at that time. Now, back home here in the USA, by 1912, there was the Lawrence, Massachusetts textile strike, known as the bread and roses, and I mean rose. They call it rose because it was the main instigator was Rose Schneiderman, and that's the instigator of that strike, and in her honor, it was called bread and roses. Now, World War One was not just terrible because of the inhumanity of war. It was almost a setback for women's rights, except that except that while men were fighting abroad, women were working in industries and fields that were basically traditionally held by men, such as working in factories, which was considered men's work. With the absence of a lot of men in the workforce, a lot of women came in, and that was in Europe. That was here in America too. Um, and you see, thing is that all this was going on. This would set the foothold for the future struggle for gender equality. While with the Russian Revolution of 1917, the role of women were profound. Uh, Due to the mistreatment of women in the factories during World War One in Russia, while men were fighting abroad, many of them would go out into the streets into mass protests in places starting in Petrograd, and this kind of led way. This kind of led with other sequence of events into what would be known as the Russian Revolution, and what will eventually be known as the end of the rule of the Romanovs, who were the monarch in Russia at that time. Now, whatever one thinks of the Second Russian Revolution, or what is be known as the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin did officialize International Women's Day in 1922. Lenin, with many faults, because I'm not a practicing Leninist, so I have some issues with Vladimir Lenin and that whole movement that he espoused, which kind of led way to a split in the worldwide socialist movement at that time. Um, I have to go and give him props for recognizing women as equal under, well, at that point, Soviet law, protecting women's rights, reproductive rights, legalizing homosexuality, which includes lesbianism, and that was pretty progressive in that time. You know, with many of the strides that were made over the years, over the last, especially the last 30 years in the West, with the LGBTQ movement for equality. But unfortunately, all this was largely reversed under Joseph Stalin later on, and for all the faults of Lenin, because I can go into a commentary on what's wrong with Leninism. Um, some things were done right, and women's equality was recognized in Russia at that time. And Russia is a very traditionalist society, so it was actually pretty damn advanced forward thinking in that regard. Now, fast forward this to America during World War II. While men were fighting abroad, women were once again at the factories and other industries working to help with the war effort. You've heard of Rosie the Riveter? Yes. Now, just like the rest of the Western world, here in the USA after World War II, with the rise of what we know as the New Left, which we all would by it would be known as that by the 1960s and 70s, women's lib would become a big issue once again, and efforts like reproductive rights, pay equity, and and women reaching into work fields historically held by men, um, that would take place at that time. And the thing about it is, I'm 52 years old, and I remember as a little kid hearing talks about things like women's lib and everything like that. So, you know, uh, I was coming of age, kind of, indirectly, kind of being nurtured by this, and would appreciate this. I can imagine what how in the world people would think this was controversial, but oh well. Well, sadly, things like the Equal Rights Amendment was never ratified here in the U.S., and this was as a result of the negative reaction, or negative consequences of what I call the Reagan Revolution, economically and socially, with the assistance of the religious right. Now, the thing about it is, I'm no fan of Ronald Reagan. Obviously, he reversed the New Deal consensus in many ways, and then we are still stuck with to this day. But I think that had Ronald Reagan acted more like a center right conservative instead of reaching out to the far right, the evangelicals that became the ideological bedrock of today's Republican Party. I think he would have probably been less resistance to um, to supporting. I don't think he would have been as opposed to the ERA. Not that I'm saying that I have my criticisms of Ronald Reagan. Don't even get me started. But anyway, as a socialist partisan, I do not want to consider women like Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, Sarah Palin, or the late Margaret Thatcher as an example of women's liberation, since their ideology and policies are largely pro-capitalism, and a lot of the things that they have worked on actually furthered society to the right. Now, being a socialist partisan, once again, I will include Gro Harlem Brundtland of Norway, who was the first female prime minister of that country and became the director general of the World Health Organization. And all with Israel's faults today, Israel has a lot of faults today, but um, Israel's had was created as a socialist state in 1948. Jewish social democratic Zionists, Jewish communist Zionists set up Israel as a socialist state in many, many ways. Unfortunately, that socialism has disappeared, and Israel is largely right wing today. Largely right wing. I support the left within Israel, but I do not support the right wing government of Israel. And but I want to say that Golda Meir is she was Israel's first and only prime minister, female prime minister of Israel, and she's also an example of a woman leader leading her nation. Helen Clark of New Zealand, 1999 to 2008, was the prime minister of New Zealand, and she done a remarkable job, objectively speaking. Uh, Jacinda Ardern is the current Prime Minister of New Zealand. Also done a wonderful job fighting against COVID. Um, New Zealand, for a brief moment in the last year, probably in the last 6 months, went back to official normalcy, pre-COVID state of normality. But I'm hearing rumors that there are some lockdowns again, and I know that this is going to be a long time before any country in the world or the world community gets this COVID under control. But Jacinda Ardern has done a first-rate, awesome job, basically tackling on COVID better than the clowns that run our government here in the United States today. Um, in Denmark, since 2019, Fredriksson, Mette Fredriksson, I cannot pronounce the name, from Denmark, female prime minister. Social Democratic Party government got elected recently, and uh, Denmark is one of those countries that has one of the highest standards of living in the world. And when you look at places like Denmark and Norway, Sweden, they have more women participation in government than anywhere else in the world, and they have the highest standard of living in the world as well. And the point I'm trying to make is that this is not about political correctness, and this is not about, just crapping on men or whatever. The small little unpleasant group of that will go and crap on men and all of that. I mean, that's just, I tie that in with corporate feminism, what Kyle Kalinske called McFeminism. That's not true feminism at all. Feminism is pro working class, and it's basically the radical notion that women are people, and therefore every year I celebrate International Women's Day and consider it a largely positive holiday. And that's what I got to say right now on this day, March 23rd, 2021. If you like what you heard, press like and comment. If you disagree, well, we'll have a conversation. Comment anyway. Feel free to share the content on this channel. And of course, as a First Amendment absolutist, it's my duty to inform you that if you have a platform, utilize it. If you don't have one, create one and utilize it, because we're the muckrakers of our time. And feel free to subscribe to this channel and to basically, as I say, share the content of this channel. Hit that notification bell. And until next time, I am American democracy. Peace. Class struggle yesterday, today, tomorrow, until we have full economic and social justice for all. Economic justice for all, everyone, men, women alike.